In 2014, Euromaidan ousted pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych from power. Immediately, Russia seized Crimea without firing a single bullet and began to support the guerrillas in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian army reacted, launched an offensive and cornered the guerrillas. When the guerrillas were about to be annihilated, the Russian Italian tactical groups, the dreaded ATGMs, began to intervene and defeated Kiev troops. Hundreds of armored vehicles and trucks destroyed, millions displaced, 10,000 soldiers killed, 40% mortality rate among Ukrainian wounded soldiers. And today, only 6 years later, the drums of war are beating again in the Ukrainian plain. Now that's what happened during the terrible war of 2014. But what's happening right now? Why is Russian army mobilized around Ukraine? Why are they threatening with an invasion? What's the interest of the Russian state on this? I am Iago Rodriguez, this is Military Universe, and now, let's begin. That same year, the Minsk agreements were signed, and Ukraine was finally defeated in the Battle of the Baltsevo and Donetsk airport. Since then, Moscow and Kiev have been pursuing irreconcilable interests. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has become independent from the Russian Orthodox Church at the 2018 Synod. Crimea has been legally annexed in the eyes of Russian laws, while the Donbass, the region in the east of the country that groups Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, maintain an undefined legal status. Crimea was annexed by Russia. The oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk were not. Why? From my point of view, Vladimir Putin wanted to use both oblasts as a way to influence the Ukrainian parliament. He expected to create status of preference for both provinces, but finally he didn't reach that objective. On the other hand, economically, the Ukrainian conflict challenges the liberal thesis of international relations. The economic, social and cultural interdependence between Ukraine and Russia were very intense, but they have not served to avoid war. Not only has trade not stopped the conflict, but it has become another weapon in the conflict. Today, the logic of confrontation has led both countries to constantly boycott each other, as they seek alternative suppliers in international markets. But let's get into the heart of the matter. Will Russia go to war? And why now? Now we must take into account that the Ukrainian armed forces have been modernizing thanks to Western support. It is not the same army as 5 years ago. It is not perfect, it has a lot of problems, it is not more powerful than the Russian army, but still, it is much more powerful. For example, the Ukrainian industry has been providing a huge amount of anti-tank guided missiles. Thousands per year have been produced of local variants, such as the Stugna P. They are also acquiring certain weapons. They are getting the Turkish Bayraktar TV-2 drones, which have shown their proficiency in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Libya. From my point of view, Vladimir Putin sees that the longer it takes them to act, stronger the Ukrainian army will be. It is true that the Russian army is far superior to his Ukrainian counterpart, but such superiority can only be materialized if an attack mobilizes such a large number of Russian forces that Ukrainians are completely overwhelmed. In other words, if Russia launches several army corps from the Belarusian and Ukrainian borders with thousands of armored vehicles, air support, anti-aircraft protection, logistics, etc., Ukrainians will be saturated. Kiev won't be able to defend itself against an attack from so many directions, so that gaps will open up on the Ukrainian front, through which armored forces will penetrate and therefore disrupt Ukrainian logistics, roads, reserves, airfields and command posts. They are professionalizing, they are getting more training. So if there is a limited war, that will be relatively comfortable for the Ukrainians. Let's say there is a war just for the Donbass again. There is a relatively small territory to fight in, and so you cannot deploy such a huge amount of troops. Russia wouldn't be able to materialize its superiority through the numbers, for example. The other option for Russia involves a long and wearing guerrilla campaign supported by Moscow, but the problem with this option is that it requires time and attrition. An option that is not attractive to a political leader, not to say that such a plan is historically unprecedented. They would use guerrilla, but not just as a guerrilla organization, right? It would be guerrilla tactics used by the Russian army. What elements of the Russian army? Mainly special forces, the Spetsnaz, the light infantry, all of those units, boosted by the equipment of the Russian army on the frontier. Artillery support, air force support, all of that stuff. So it would be like a boosted guerrilla trying to provoke attrition on the Ukrainians. In any case, Moscow is demonstrating will to act. For example, Numerous divisions are being transferred from Russian Far East, numbering some troops close to Siberia who have traveled thousands of kilometers and who have built permanent barracks along the border with Ukraine. There we have the example of the 1st Tank Army, an offensive shock unit whose mission is to provide a strategic pull to defend Moscow and which has also moved into the frontier with Ukraine. Now, why is winter the best moment of the year to attack? First of all, during autumn or spring, it is very difficult to act because there is a lot of mud. You cannot use comfortably your mechanized forces. While in winter, everything gets frozen, and that's perfect to use all those mechanized forces to launch a fast and deep strike. On the other hand, it is the moment when a big part of Central Europe depends on the Russian gas. So even if, let's say, Germany wants to support Ukraine during the war, they won't be able to because the pressure of the gas will be over their heads. In short, we are facing a Helix poker game in which Putin is either calling a huge bluff or is demonstrating his willingness to use the ace of spades. Putin actually wants assurances that NATO and the EU will not expand into Ukraine, something that should be secured by a written treaty or some sort of agreement that gives Moscow significant leverage over Ukraine. The best victory is the one that you get without firing a shot, like in Crimea. So probably Vladimir Putin wants this kind of victory. He wants a negotiation that satisfies him. But what will happen if the West, if NATO, if the United States don't want to negotiate anything? Will he strike? After Russia's gigantic military and political effort to force the Western powers to negotiate, it seems hard to believe that Moscow is willing to go home empty-handed, as that would be a serious blow to Moscow's hard-won image and credibility. This means that even if all is just a bluff, if the Western powers do not give away on certain issues, Russia will have to make at least a show of force to preserve its credibility. But to pursue the analysis further, we cannot only focus on the military. An infernal poker. Since Minsk agreements, peace has never really settled in the Donbass, with constant artillery exchanges reminding us that there is something unsettled, something where Moscow and Kiev deeply disagree. That the shelling has never stopped is not a mere coincidence. Last spring and summer, the Russian army already mobilized gigantic masses of troops, including more than 100,000 men along the Ukrainian border. That was both a warning and an attempt to exert pressure. After all, for the other side to agree to negotiate, it has to perceive a real problem or threat. And for that to happen, and for this perception to be generated, you need to demonstrate your willingness and ability to materialize your threats if necessary. In order to compel, in order to dissuade, you need to use two tools. First of all, show your military capability, show your military strength, and on the other hand, you need to show political will, right? I have a strong sword, and I have the will to use it. How do you show that? On the first hand, we have the credibility gained by Putin during the last decade. Second of all, you need to show that you are willing to go to war, right? And that's why they are mobilizing the army, doing all those exercises, asking the foreign affairs minister of Russia to say, oh, there is a risk of war, the chief of the armed forces of Russia, all that stuff, right? I'm sending the message that I'm willing to act. And also I am Vladimir Putin, so I'm very prestigious and I have credibility. And finally, I need to show that military strength. That's what I'm doing by moving units from the Far East Russia to the Ukrainian frontier, for example. That's what I'm doing when I am able to mobilize 100,000 soldiers, more than the British army, for example, in the Ukrainian frontier. And finally, I would add another thing. For the Russians, the most important part, or not the most important, the most definitive part that defines, in that sense, definitive because it defines the war, is the previous moment to the war and the initial stages of the war, right? So that's when the Russians try to maneuver to reach their objectives. And that's what's happening right now. And in the next phase, depending on the way that they realize, they develop their offensive operations, they will send one message or another and they will still be trying to get their objectives. So even the first phase of the Ukraine war wouldn't be only military, but also a political move. And at this point, we must ask ourselves the big question. What does Putin gain and what does he lose in this situation? Russian interest in Ukraine has deep roots. Ukraine has been linked to Moscow in one way or another throughout the entire modern age. And it was only in the late 90s that Ukraine became a fully independent state from Russia. Even since the 90s, trade and cultural relations between the both countries have been extremely intense, to the point that even in 2015, the year of the war, Russia was still the leading investor in Ukraine with $1.5 billion. Ukraine's Philo-Russian East also tends to concentrate a large part of the wealth and population of the country, with the result that conquering half of Ukraine would provide a 10% increase in Russia's total population. If the historical, cultural, social and economic ties were not enough, Ukraine is also, together with Belarus, a fundamental part of Russia's defensive conception. So as you know, this isolated, this siege mentality by the Russians is very important. They feel that they have been invaded by many countries throughout history. That's why they develop that obsession with the geography, with geopolitics, because all those invasions came through the plains of Europe or Asia. And in that sense, they want to create buffer zones, they want to create forward defenses, we could say. And that's why Belarus or Ukraine are so important for them. Also because of historical, even emotional reasons. You know, they feel linked to those countries. Now, from the Ukrainian point of view, it is natural to consider Ukraine as a nation-state with its own interests and aspirations. From this point of view, it is reasonable that they do not wish to be considered a mere buffer zone, but a country with the legitimacy to choose whether to join NATO, the European Union, or whatever they desire. As we can see, the visions and interests of Kiev and Moscow clash diametrically, and that is why the only tool capable of breaking this Gordian knot is the military one, also accompanied by the relevant economical and political considerations. So Russia wants to stop through a treaty with NATO or the United States the expansion of that organization. On the other hand, it is legitimate that NATO can expand. Why has NATO not allowed Ukraine to come into the organization? Because if you are not truly willing to defend that country, to send troops, to send an army and to face Russia, you must never accept a new member. The United States don't consider Ukraine such an important interest to send his armed forces there. However, they are agreed to have certain partnership and support in certain ways that country. On the other hand, it is the European Union. It is not a political or a military entity. It may be, they may feel threatened on the long term by the EU, but it is true that the European Union represents certain cultural and economical attractiveness and influence on Ukraine that Moscow doesn't want to see on his backyard. Economic sanctions have rarely prevented the conflict, and often they become a mere punitive tool. However, they can inflict a huge damage, and so they must not be ignored. Biden's response to Putin points to the fact that the US would punish a Russian high-intensity offensive through two tools. First and foremost, sanctions. In this case, this would be sanctions of two types. General ones aimed at damaging the Russian economy in general, in order to deprive Russia of technological advances and income, while at the same time causing popular anger. Finally, targeted sanctions against key individuals from Russian elite. A second tool would be military assistance to Ukraine in the form of trainers, financial support and delivery of sophisticated weaponry. Hey guys, so that's the first video of this YouTube channel. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry for my broken English. I know it is not the best, but still I hope that the content is interesting and provide you with new insights on what's going on. So that's all. If you want to support me, I will let you my Patreon. You can donate me through there or through PayPal. Everything will be down in the description. And well, that's all guys. I hope you have enjoyed the video and see you in the next time.